This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Abdul Alkalimat, Professor Emeritus in the Department of African American Studies at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is one of the original creators and innovators in the field of Black studies, whose organizing and professional work expanded the field in terms of its professional organizations, rigor of inquiry, curriculum, and political significance. As well, he is the author of pamphlets, scholarly articles, and a number of books, including most recently, the critical work, A History of Black Studies, published in 2022 by Pluto Press. In this discussion, we explore the nature of Black Studies inquiry, the link between Black Studies scholarly and classroom work and our various publics, and the particular ethical and political obligations that lie at the heart of the field. Good afternoon, Professor. How are you today?
Doing well. It's a little cold over here, but doing well. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear. I mean, I'm here in Maryland. It's actually a beautiful day, 45 and sunny, but it is January, I guess. But welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. We were talking a little bit before I hit record. This is such a privilege to have you on the podcast. Your work in the field of Black Studies is as important as anybody in this field, and really having your voice as part of the series from the very beginning, from imagining it. Ashley Newby, my colleague, and I had you as one of these people. We really wanted your perspective on the field, on the podcast. And so this is a real treat and a real privilege to have you on. So we'll have a conversation, and I'm really happy you made the time. But just thank you for your thoughtfulness and your willingness to contribute to this project, because you're really such an important figure and important voice to have as part of this series.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, let me start. I'll ask you. We'll discuss sort of how you understand the field of Black studies, where it's been, where it's going, its strengths, its shortcomings. But I wanted to start maybe before those questions to really ask you a more personal question, which is, what drew you to the study of Black life? What got you interested in Black studies? And always for me, this question of what sustains you in relation to this field and to this kind of study.
Well, thank you for that question. Of course, for somebody in their 80s, asking about their own intellectual journey is quite a question.
We've got the time.
Okay. There are really two ways that I think about it. One is in terms of family, and the other is in terms of generation. In my family, on my mother's side, my grandfather was one of the early members of the Communist Party in Chicago, married to a woman from Germany. So that's on the one hand. And my aunt, for example, was a staff member of the National Negro Congress, and was then loaned out to the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and she helped to organize steel with William Z. Foster. So that's on the one side. On the other side, my father's family, my great-great-grandfather, Frank McWhorter, known as Free Frank, was one of the slaves that hired out, was able to, in the end, purchase 16 family members out of slavery. And he was the first African-American to legally found, plat, and register a town in the United States in 1830 in Illinois. So I grew up with that story, those two stories. On the one hand, the left; on the other hand, Black liberation. And it was just our family story. So it was just normal. And then I was born in the Francis Cabrini projects in Chicago, which was a housing project as subsidy for war workers. My father was a steel worker, and they were transformed to produce armaments in the steel factory. So it was an integrated working class projects, and the Communist Party was located in that projects. And one of the interesting things is that everybody knows about Pete Seeger and so on. But we had Win Strachey, who was the labor songman who taught us all the labor songs. And so it was integrated in the 1940s. So it was a very interesting family basis on which, my disc was formatted. But then generationally, it was the Emmett Till experience. He was from Chicago. I was from Chicago. I remember when his mother came around and gave talks in the community. And it was a very shocking reality that we all faced. And if people want to make a reference to it, they can look at the Jet magazine where the picture of Emmett Till was on the cover. And so the entire community was sort of shocked into that level of barbarism. And so as a generation, we were formed by that Emmett Till experience. And I remember after my mother and father got divorced and I went to live with an aunt in Kansas City, we actually read the confession that was given by the murderers after the trial was over. And we sat on the porch of my aunt's house talking about we needed to form it. I'm in high school. They needed to form an army to go to the South to deal with that. And so that really was a foundation. And then, of course, I decided to become a lawyer. But then I started taking courses in philosophy and I started thinking, and so that took me to the Black intellectual history, which then led me to Chicago, the University of Chicago, for graduate school. And the two questions that really are the abstract questions that have driven me. One is, what is the Black experience? I mean, there is one thing to live it. There's another thing to read about it, and to read about it from different perspectives, and to realize that a lot of what you read has little clear relevance to what you're living, and the difference between what people think and what sort of writers write, that whole contradiction. But the second question is how to change it, because the motion of people is to make life better, to solve their problems. And contrary to what some people think, the grand narrative of Black history is the freedom narrative, how to make life better. So unfortunately, some people's lives get better and they stop thinking about everybody else's life. But the point I'm trying to make is that in general, those two questions, what is the Black experience and how to change it, are really the two dominant questions that have driven me into realms of culture, politics, language, and not only how has it changed, but how to intervene in relationship to that change. And the interesting thing about my experience in graduate school really was to meet and deal with academics who were being purposeful from their point of view into political change. I mean, in other words, University of Chicago, there was Milton Friedman on the one hand, and then there was Richard Flax, who came out of the background of forming SDS. That contradiction. The intramural football team I was on, we were called the Bolsheviks.
Wow. At University of Chicago.
Exactly.
Milton Friedman's nightmare. I love this.
That is another side to what was happening at the U of C in the 1960s. For example, Morris Janowitz, who was the chair of the sociology department at one point, he met with Orlando Wilson, who was the head of the Chicago Police Department, for a weekly lunch as an advisor. And he had written an essay called The Social Control of the Escalated Riot, and had been involved in military sociology. And so we saw that. And so we, thought it would be absolutely normal for us to have that same kind of relationship with the Black liberation movement.
Hmm.
In other words, the application of knowledge to social change. Thesis 11. So here we are. They, of course, didn't exactly see it that way, but that was the contradiction we were dealing with. My advisor was Peter Rossi in the sociology department. And, he had memories of being a young progressive and, finding his way. And so he was generally supportive. I was at the NORC, the National Opinion Research Center. And when I left graduate school to join SNCC in Mississippi, he actually gave me interviewing taping equipment so that I could do some work while I was and tried to then, he actually eventually lured me out of the movement back to graduate school, where we did a comparative study of school desegregation in 16 cities. And we traveled in salt and pepper teams to interview people. That was really a tremendous experience because I was inside the movement, interviewing people who were on the ground, telling the experience of how do you navigate change under those conditions. And so while on the one hand, I was in contradiction to what was happening at the University of Chicago, on the other hand, the University of Chicago actually empowered me to carry out the work that I was doing and armed me with science that I've continued to use in my entire career.
I'm glad I asked the question. This is fabulous. That's quite a legacy to inherit as a child. When you talked about your family legacy, in an amazing way of I imagine of being, the level of expectation about how you intervene in the world is quite serious, but also that sense of the possible. When you said University of Chicago in the 1960s, I did think Friedman. I hadn't thought of until you started talking about it, about this experience of contradiction and how, what that does, what that produces, especially out of that legacy. Contradictions are there to be exploited for other possibilities.
Well, it's interesting because at the U of C, at one of the cafeterias, we used to meet, and a whole cadre of people who became really important in terms of the left wing in the United States gathered. And so inside the University of Chicago, there was always the development of an opposition. And the importance really of understanding dialectics gives people a way of thinking even about the current political situation in the United States. In other words, it looks like, the Grim Reaper is taken over and all is lost. And the reality is that it's always darkest before the dawn, and we have to look at what are the objective realities that are going to develop that create new opportunities for progressive thinking and understanding of how to move the society in a different direction. So that's where philosophy is so important, that at an abstract level, we can begin to understand processes. And that's what we really had to learn, that philosophy is for everybody and not some esoteric, polysyllabic, secret field that is irrelevant for common sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say, my PhD is in philosophy, so I suspect some people will suspect I planted these comments on the relevance. But I like that. I mean, I really always try to emphasize, critical theory, philosophy. It helps us see things that are hidden but are right in front of us. And we need all of our ways of seeing in times of crisis, but also in times of joy and pleasure and possibility, but especially in times of crisis, that there's something there. And I like that. I appreciate that reminder because, this won't come out for a few weeks in terms of our scheduling, but we are 8 days into a far-right presidency. And I think that reminder that you just said, what is the objective reality? What are the contradictions sitting there? And what does that mean for us as radical or progressive thinkers, right?
Yeah.
What possibilities open up?
Yeah.
And maybe we need to also start naming our intramural teams the Bolsheviks. That would be a good starting point. That's going to stick with me. I don't know why, but I just absolutely love that. Well, let me ask you about the field of Black studies and how you think about it. And this is a funny thing to ask you. You came out with the history of Black studies and really documenting what the field is, what it's been, what it means has been so much of your work for years and years. But, I'll ask it this way. We're in 2025, we're 55, 56 years out of the founding of Black studies as a field. And we still have, I think, we are still in some ways dealing with and grappling with the origins, this tension at the origins of the field, one of which was the demand for the study of the Black intellectual tradition, right? That the disciplines hadn't represented this tradition, hadn't represented Black life. Black studies was where we could study, think, and develop that sense of tradition. But also, of course, that was a time of the really militant turn in Black liberation struggle that tried to collapse that distinction between campus and community, between intellectual life and prescriptive political action. And so that political demand of Black studies and the intellectual demand of Black studies, that's at its origin, but it's something I think we still wrestle with today, how to think those things together, how to think that tension. So I'm interested to hear you talk broadly. We could also list your bibliography, but how you think of the field of Black studies in 2025, but also how you think about it in relation to this origin story.
Yeah, thank you for that question. But you're absolutely right that the book that I wrote, The History of Black Studies, really lays out a conceptual approach to answering that question. Because I see Black studies as having these three historical forms of development. One being Black studies as intellectual history, and the interesting contradiction there are three different sort of river flows that I identify as part of that intellectual history. On the one hand, the individual journeys of the first generation of PhDs was so important. And across all the disciplines. And for the most part, they were navigating their way through racist institutional experiences and the struggle to assert the legitimacy of Black subject matter. And so that's on the one hand. Secondly, of course, the HBCUs, where there was a tremendous generational production of knowledge. So places like Howard and Fisk were examples of, people use the term dream team. You can't imagine what it was like to be at Howard or Fisk when, in those golden years of great productivity and so on. So the HBCUs. And then a third, of course, is the community itself. A lot of times in America generally, there's contradiction between institutions of higher education and the masses of people are viewed hierarchically, as if there is a special role of institutions of higher education as opposed to simply a particular role, as opposed to other particular roles. So in the community, you had literary societies, museums, institutions of publications that represented the intellectual life of the Black community. In other words, the origins of Black studies really is in the anti-racist assertion that Black people had minds, had a focus on trying to understand their own experience. And so that was in Black studies, intellectual history. Then the second main focus is Black studies as social movement. In other words, every movement, and I tried to describe 6 such social movements, had within it an educational component. And the contradiction is between, on the one hand, mass education, on the other hand, cadre education, education for activists and staffing of these social movements. You could even make the distinction between discussion and reading, And then, of course, the third is Black studies that emerged as a Black power movement project to transform and create space in institutions of higher education, so the movement into the mainstream. But the precedent for this struggle around Eurocentrism and racism actually took place within the HBCUs initially. And so I show how the curriculum of the HBCUs initially were on the same Eurocentric model as mainstream institutions in the country. And there had to be a struggle. You read the experience of people who were at Howard, like A.B. Spellman and Amiri Baraka and so on, that, they had to relate to Sterling Brown and others, independent of the formal curriculum. So even at Howard, as late as when they went there, you had that struggle going on. But in the institutions of higher education, it was not an intellectual initiative. It was a political initiative that transformed those institutions, and is a political struggle that continues to today. And it's an interesting challenge to individuals to have their own life, their own freedom to do their intellectual work, and yet at the same time accept the responsibility of more of a collective identity and a challenge to how one uses a certain level of privilege and a certain access to resources, and as opposed to ignoring that broader role. This comes down in terms of really specific things, like, do I teach a course because it's something I'm personally interested in? It's something that meets my own idiosyncratic interest this year as opposed to last year or next year or whatever. And by the way, I mean, I'm from the generation that created the possibility so that people had that kind of freedom. Because before us, you didn't have that kind of freedom. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time now, we realize that there's a collective need that exists, and somebody has to accept that responsibility, and collectively, Black Studies has that responsibility. In other words, Black Studies doesn't exist because any given generation was smart. Black people have always been smart. That's not the criteria. The criteria had to do with Black liberation struggles that created space in the society in general and on campus that forced the institution to accept certain things. And some institutions did it, every institution did it its own way. But anyway, so my sense of what is Black Studies really has to continue to represent those three phenomena. In other words, what's fundamental about Black people in general, the social movements, and by the way, I mean, in this Black Lives Matter, there were young people who were actually thinking they were doing something totally new, and they didn't have to read. And, they were wrong. I mean, they have to read, and they have to learn, And then, of course, in the context of our campuses today, there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. There is so much to think about in that. That was some really profound thinking, and anyone who doesn't have the book, the History of Black Studies book, should get it upon hearing that. But you put so many challenges to us, and I'm especially moved by this question of, what should I teach rather than what would I like to teach? I think, as you said, that's something that's very hard for generations, that live in the world that, as you said, that you created, the ability to say that and ask one. But also this question of education and reading and study in relation to politics. I'm thinking about it. Hasn't come out yet, but by the time that yours is on the series, it will have come out. A podcast I did with a couple of people at the W.B. Du Bois Abolition School in Philadelphia, and their insistence is we do political education. They have a reader. They read Angela Davis. They read Du Bois. They read Assata Shakur. And the idea is that organizing, activism, everything that community work is doing is made better by study, right? And that study is important, but also that immediate concern with what does the community need, what are the contradictions it lives with, and how do we intervene, also directs that sense of study. So these two podcasts really have a nice synergy to them. I like that.
Yeah. See, what's interesting, I think, is to place Black studies in the history of higher education in the United States in general. In other words, I had this experience in teaching in Germany at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies in Berlin. And what was interesting is that in Germany, there's a tendency to be very abstract and at the same time, very particular. In other words, if you were studying African American culture, somebody might write a paper on the jazz piano style of Bud Powell between the years of this and that. Whereas in the United States, people would write a paper on bebop, and make a lot of generalizations, et cetera. But in the United States, there was a turn toward practice, toward practical use of knowledge. And this is particularly evident in the land-grant institutions like the University of Illinois. In other words, the whole purpose of the university itself was to apply the knowledge to make the society better. And so not only schools like law schools and business schools and colleges of agriculture, et cetera, they weren't there just to theorize about plants and animals. They were trying to grow better corn and impact the economy. I mean, that's the whole purpose. And so the idea that Black studies would be inappropriately connected to improving the quality of life in the Black community is a bunch of crap. It's precisely part of the way in which higher education in the United States has functioned. It's to make life better. It's not just to perform middle-class activities. So anyway, that's really the key. And so on the other hand, it becomes not a progressive idea to reduce what we do in research and teaching to some immediate practical payoff. Sort of like a student coming into class saying, how's this going to help me get a job, tomorrow? What are you talking about in terms of history or this or that? I mean, so we have to work with the reality that knowledge is always asked to be relevant. And yet at the same time, that relevancy can't be reduced to some immediate practical payoff, like how is this going to increase my income immediately, et cetera. I don't want to take that course, But the broader question really of how a department can manage the contradiction between individual activities of faculty and graduate students and a more collective responsibility. I produced a pamphlet called 10 Action Plans for Black Studies that addresses this question. For example, every Black Studies department might want to consider having a written history of itself, which is very clarifying. And that hasn't existed. In fact, every Black Studies department, it doesn't even have an archive of itself. So that's an important task. Another important task is every Black community associated with any given institution doesn't have a history of itself. So, for example, when I was at the University of Toledo, we produced an anthology on the Black Toledo, its history. Certainly, Chicago has many, many, many books about Chicago. But every Black community needs a history of itself. Also, Black liberation organizations need histories at the local level. Judson Jeffries at Ohio State University is doing great work in doing local history and gathering local histories of the Black Panther Party. In other words, there are these histories that, review Bobby and Huey and, Oakland, New Haven, et cetera. But the real story is also in all those local areas and the local activists, who became Panthers. That is, and the same is true with SNCC and NAACP, et cetera. So there are a lot of interesting challenges that, and the way I look at it also is in terms of reinterpreting our classrooms. A lot of times our classrooms are what we would call sites of intellectual consumption. You produce a syllabus, it has a reading list, and you give lectures and lead discussions, and people go there and they drink from the fountain of knowledge. So it's consumption. But we can also transform our classrooms into sites of intellectual production. And here I'm talking about the utility beyond just the heuristic device of I can learn how to write a term paper. I can demonstrate that I've read the list. I read the bibliography that you gave me in the syllabus. And so this doesn't change the academic decisions for individual scholarship that faculty might have. But it does say that we can use our classrooms and the collective work of our students to produce something useful to the community. I was just having a discussion with a colleague who was initiating a course on the Black working class. And so we were discussing, they were asking me different questions. We were discussing bibliographies, et cetera, et cetera. And I finally asked the person, I said, well, what are you going to have the students do as requirements for their own work to satisfy the course? And they said, well, some papers that just are thought papers based on their reading. And I was saying, well, since the course you're having is a course in connection with the Center for Labor Studies, Black Studies and Labor Studies, what would it be like to, this is a graduate level seminar type course, what would you think about having the class imagine itself as a collective research team to write a volume on the working class in your state, the Black working class. And, what a wonderful thing that would be if you had, say, 10 or 15 students and they were able to develop a division of labor, taking into consideration history, industrial diversity, self-organization of Black workers, et cetera, over time, what a useful document that would be for the community, for the workers, for the trade unions. So the classroom is a site of intellectual production. And if you think about it across the country, how many classes exist? I mean, if you're talking about thousands of hours of student labor in research that could produce things that were not so much a alternative from what's going on, but rather a way of producing higher usefulness to what's going on in relationship to the community. At the University of Illinois, we discovered that a great deal of research had been done on the community, but very little of it had been shared with the community. So they were extracting knowledge out of the community, but not sharing it with the community. And so we started working on revealing that to the community. Mm-hmm. And then also we had a project called Honoring the Difference Makers. And we identified 100 people in the Champaign-Urbana community that had made contributions, PTAs, all kinds of contributions. And we wrote short bios about them and produced a booklet and brought them onto campus and had a ceremony. And in other words, the university itself has resources and assets, status that it can grant to people. It grants it to itself. Academics do that all the time. They give each other awards and so on. And the circulation of elites, you could call that. But we often don't share those things. And so we've really tried to do things like make sure that the art galleries on campus bring local artists to have exhibits, because that's, again, another resource that's very important. Writers, and activists in general, so teaching a course on Black religion or the Black church, bringing ministers on campus to, they do it all the time in business school and law school. We don't often do it ourselves. And that is a way of helping the students understand that when they leave the campus, they're not leaving the intellectual community. They're joining another intellectual community. And so anyway, it's kind of a ramble, but
no, it's not a ramble.
You got me talking, so.
No, this is, I love this, the way you wrap that up, I think is so important. And it's come up in other conversations. And I just think it's so crucial for us to all think about how we imagine in a Black studies context what intellectual life is, right? And thinking about it as something other than, our benighted seminar, right? But that our seminar itself is a process of intellectual life that has this expansive sense. And, until you put it that way, I hadn't actually thought about it myself. So, I'll give you... Going forward, this will be a thing on my mind and said to my students. So you're joining a different intellectual community in a different way, but it's an extension of everything we've been talking about. I think about, it's the second day of classes, teaching a seminar on James Baldwin. James Baldwin is always, where does he get his wisdom? It's Bessie Smith, and that idea that vernacular culture, everyday lives and sort of expressive life around that is what now, a advanced seminar on his nonfiction or something. What does it mean to take that seriously, this relationship between two communities? I always want to say campuses are communities too, but two communities that share an intellectual life just in different modalities, registers, habits, and so forth. Anyway, this is to say that was wonderfully put. And let me ask a question, sort of moving to your own work, and ask you sort of how you think about the field of Black studies. But I'm also interested in, hearing you talk a little bit about how, having done a PhD in sociology and all of those methodologies and sensibilities that come with that. You've already talked about how your own sort of experience, around the civil rights movement and SNCC and so forth intervened to really, I imagine, really change that sense of what sociology meant for you. But you had that disciplinary training, but then your life has really been spent in and making the field of Black studies. So I'm interested in how you think that movement from a disciplinary education with very specific methodologies to an area studies that has this different kind of expansiveness about methods, about sources, about archives, about where intellectual life is and how to process it. How that movement from, just to put it bluntly, a discipline to area studies, how that's impacted how you do scholarship, how you think about scholarship, and also how you construct a classroom. I think you've already spoken to a bit of the classroom, but just how it's shaped that in a way that a disciplinary education and life trajectory would have been very different.
Yeah. What an interesting question. We actually attack the idea of discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just us. It happened for all disciplines. What is the English department? They study film. They study all kinds of stuff. It's not what it used
English
to be.
is barely a discipline at this point. Yeah.
No, exactly. Or anthropology. What is the common methodology of, people? On the one hand, they're voyeurs, they're observing other people, et cetera. And then there's, people doing, there's all linguists, they're in anthropology. People don't even read the same journals. The 1960s really was a breakout of a lot of concerns. And area studies is really an arm of imperialism.
Yeah, that phrase is very fraught, I know, yeah.
Studying different parts of the world for reasons. And so the origin of all of this is really important to understand the limitations that these concepts have. In other words, the argument that a discipline has a common methodology. No, that's wrong. Sociology, for example, we had demographers. One of the things that Chicago did was, if you came from China or you came from some other country, they would automatically put you in demography. There are too many of you all. You got to study that. It was crazy.
Wow.
So what has happened is that there's been a tendency toward big science and the aggregation of fields to deal with these new questions. So biology, chemistry, physics, they're all studying the same questions, the big questions. And increasingly that's happening in the social sciences and in the humanities. So these borders, these silos no longer make a great deal of sense. And so that Black studies then becomes a way of saying, how can these various so-called disciplines contribute to an understanding of this great social reality? And one of the interesting problems is that we have this lingering past that forces us to accept mystifications, if not lies and deceptions. For example, take the word race. People use the word race. University of Chicago has a Center for Race and Politics. It has a department, listen to this, of race and indigeneity. You know what I mean? Anything but Black studies, Mm-hmm. I'm going to send on my list shortly a list of about 13 or 14 different names that Black studies is called. by academic departments around the country. It's sort of like, what's up with that? In other words, you can't have any unity. I mean, in other words, there are departments of sociology in most places. Now, Harvard used to call it the Department Social Relations, under which was sociology, anthropology, psychology, et cetera. They had to get up off of that and have a Department of Sociology because it was consistent with the needs of an institution that was generalized around the country. If you transfer from one institution to the next and you want credit for courses that you've taken, it's important to have the name of the course be relatively similar. And then you had to have the syllabus actually reviewed by the faculty of the new institution to see whether or not you could get credit for a course that's on their books. So having standardization of course titles makes sense, at least at some level. So Economics 101, you don't have to necessarily teach Samuelson, or whatever textbook is, but it's understood that there will be X number of topics that you will cover in a course called Economics 101 or Biology 101. I mean, but in Black Studies, we still have, you could call it a great deal of diversity. You could call it chaos. You could call it anything you want. But I mean, the point is, it's not standardized.
Yeah.
And I want to really make a big argument about that. But we're trapped really in a desire for freedom by individuals in Black Studies that reflect a resistance to accepting the social responsibility of a historical process that can lead to permanency and not just the flavor of the month.
Yeah. First of all, I'm very interested in that list of names. My department just recently renamed itself. And there's so much at stake once you get people talking about the name. And you learn that, I don't quite know how to put it delicately, but you just learn about people's anxieties around certain terms. For the record, I advocated for Black Studies. I like that as the blanket term, but we went with African American and Africana Studies. But, there are so many lists, and as you said, some that want to get rid of the Africa and the Black part, and that's Then on the, when this is happening, we shouldn't be surprised what you said, that there's a kind of chaos or disorganization around, what would an introductory course or just introductory curriculum look like? What should everybody who studies the field know? Those conversations inside departments are some of my least favorite. But when I was at Amherst College, we had a great two introductory courses. I will always hold on to those, but it took some real bloodletting to get everybody on the same page. But, But as you said, I mean, this is a way that I don't know if it's the slow development of the field, 50-something years, or what it is, but traditional disciplines and departments have a different idea of what you need, as you said, what you need to know coming out of Economics 101. And I like this reminder that this has to be part of our discussions in the field. Well, this is, you were talking about disciplines and Black Studies and sort of, the way these boundaries, I mean, it's difficult even to talk about so many disciplines as anything with strict boundaries. But I want to ask this question. It's almost like a futurist question to maybe recast the question of sort of what is Black Studies, which is, what would be the ultimate success of the field? Would it be that these disciplines, however porous and expansive they are, that had so neglected the study of Black life, are so transformed by Black studies, because I think Black studies has done that. I think like English and history, for example, the idea that you would have multiple people working on Black literature and Black history, I think is just a given in most departments at this point. And Black studies, I think, is the reason for that. So it's a total transformation of disciplines, really the success of Black studies? Or is the success of Black studies something more like articulating what is unique about this field of study, that whatever impact we have on disciplines, we are still our own thing? And I say this because if it's about transforming the disciplines, in some ways, the ultimate purpose of Black studies is to no longer be needed. And so my source for this is this final comment that Richard Wright makes in his essay, The Literature of the American Negro, where he says, we won't write about race once white people stop beleaguering us, right? I mean, it's Richard Wright, so we know he doesn't actually believe that's ever possible. But he does say, we write about race because there are racists, right? But ultimately, Black people writing literature will be completely different outside of this political, social, cultural milieu, right? If we have so transformed the disciplines, is there a need for Black studies? Or is Black studies something so distinct that it actually cannot be absorbed or digested?
Yeah, well, it's a question we've faced since the very beginning of Black studies, that question.
Yeah.
And of course, one answer is, if you can imagine the United States being a society free of racism and the legacy of racism, then you can conceive of a time when Black studies shouldn't be needed. If you want to point to the English department, you have to point to other departments like economics, and where you have the exact opposite impact, where many of the biggest and most important economics departments had never had a Black professor or a tenured professor or a history of graduating graduate students. And of course, you have the narrowing of the field to become a servant activity to capitalist development, as opposed to the historical study of political economy and the possibility of post-capitalist economics that would be more in sync with the history of the world than what's going on in most economics departments and the quantitative empiricist particularity that guides achievement in the field. So, no, I think we're rather than seeing it at the end, I think we're just at the beginning. See, the end looks for things are getting better. Look at what's happening in the English department. I mean, take the University of Chicago Department of English. They have a big focus on Black studies and want to hire people and really, put an emphasis on that. But we still have the relationship between the city of Chicago, the Black community of Chicago, and that institution. And it would only be a certain kind of Black studies program that would be like a college of agriculture in relationship to the agriculture of that state. But when they created the Black studies program, they called it race and indigeneity. Their center, and Michael Dawson, a friend of mine, good guy, really important intellectual, and made great contributions to political science. But naming that institute Race and Politics, it sounds like 1950s South Africa. I mean, race is a social construct. But what's missing in that way of describing it is because it's a socially constructed lie. In other words, race always has a biological reference. It's not the same word as ethnicity. It's not the same word as culture. And so the American Anthropological Association has said, race is a lie. It doesn't exist. There's one race, human race, if you want to use the word. So we're caught in ways that constantly need corrective and constantly need the diverse backgrounds that are needed to talk about the diversity and the complexity of Black life in this country and throughout the world. And unfortunately, what we're caught in also is the individual institutional culture. So at the University of Maryland is different from the University of Chicago or the University of Michigan. And every Black Studies program has had to become part of that individual reality. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, there are forces in the society that balance out those individual diversity. For example, the National Science Foundation has a office for sociology, and they give money to sociology. And they have a way of circulating professors in and out of that office to serve as program officers, et cetera, to manage that money. There is the American Council of Learned Societies. There are these professional organizations that serve as a way of helping to standardize the field. But in Black Studies, we're still trapped in the ideological origins of Black Studies. So at the Association for Study of Afro-American Life and History, or the National Council for Black Studies, or the African American Intellectual History group, many of the sort of elite institutions, the Ivy Leagues, University of Michigan, et cetera, they don't even participate in these things. Mm-hmm. You never see them at the meetings, et cetera. They circulate among themselves. So the brother who was the head of the Schomburg goes to Harvard. He's there for a hot second, then he goes to Princeton. And people bounce around like that. And they have other New York Times and other Chronicle of Higher Education and other institutions that say they're the best and give them awards, and the foundations give them a lot of money. But that has little to do with the vast amount of people who are in the field of Black Studies. So we don't have mechanisms that bring together everybody to standardize knowledge and to therefore have as a priority the goals of academic excellence and social responsibility. And these are that's the slogan, that I created years ago that was adopted by NCBS to represent the essence of Black Studies.
I'm glad I asked this. This really brilliant response. And like so much of what you've been talking about, real challenges to us thinking not only in our classrooms or at our universities or in the field broadly, but I like this reminder that professional organizations and their relationships to funds, right? Yeah. And also the political organization that we don't have of which we don't have a robust version in Black Studies in a moment. And because this is January 28th, 2025, where the field is going to have this new wave of attacks and precarity, I think.
Yes.
I mean, it's come up in other podcast conversations, and I think it's got to be a constant theme for all of us. Where's our defense?
Yeah.
Right? You talked about this moment where you were sitting on a porch in Kansas City. We need an army to go into the South right after what happened to Emmett Till, and I don't mean to make them the same thing because they're very different, obviously, but it's, we don't have an organization that provides that level of defense that's coherent and expansive in that way. So I like I hope that hangs on people's conscience listening to this. It will in mine. So I appreciate that a lot. And maybe it's actually part of an answer to this second to last question I had for you of what you think that the field of Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah, I found this to be, it's interesting I don't want to be a curmudgeon. I don't want to be, sort of down on the history of Black studies, because it's been a wonderful and very exciting way of observing new developments. I think that there are contradictions. On the one hand, Black studies has done a great deal to unleash creativity. Black studies has been like the music, I mean, it's just been, if you think about bebop, you can call it, everything is bebop, but within that, there's all this creativity. And, it's silly to try to rank the great musicians. I mean, there are just so many. And every time you then hear somebody you've never heard of before, and, it's at the level of Bud Powell or Monk, So there's been a lot of creativity. But what we've lacked, this is what I've been arguing, is standardization. In other words, what is it that, like at UMass Amherst, they have a project for the graduate students that there's a list of 100 books. And when you enter their program as a cohort, you spend the entire year going through those books. That seems to me to be a process to think about in every Black Studies program, particularly at the graduate level, is how do you standardize a frame of reference for undertaking any further development in the field. And how do you become legitimate? And see, the word disciplined is an interesting word, because what we're really talking about here is turf in the campus organization of its structure. Mm-hmm. And so you have then assets, the ability to hire faculty, the ability to tenure faculty, the ability to grant degrees. That's really the function of these disciplines. Mm-hmm. And so what we're talking about is, to what extent are these new developments, whether it's Black studies or gender studies or whatever, getting access to these things? And in order to do that, then the question is, what level of standardization exists? To my knowledge, the programs that are developing PhDs in Black studies have never met to discuss what does it mean to have a PhD in Black studies?
Yeah.
Or does that make any sense at all?
There's not that many. It's an event that could happen.
Definitely.
It's not a history convention or something.
And it also isn't something where an institution can say, well, we're the elite institution and we don't have to have any comparison to anybody else. I mean, that level of arrogance, need I mention what institution might say that? Come on. First of all, you're hiring people from other institutions. So PhD has to have some common frame of reference. It's just like being an undergraduate. Today, an undergraduate degree is also in question of any field. Why? Because the technology of the new society that's emerging raises questions about what does it mean to be a college-educated person? What should you know? What should you know about the world? What should you know about technology? Is it all about downloading information? What about uploading information? Creating? What about, should you learn code? Should you be able to actually intervene and code and change it to work with it? What does it mean to be educated in the 21st century? That's an interesting question, because there are people who are graduating from college who are not well informed or educated on certain questions. This isn't the past. We have to have, I've been involved in some discussions regarding computer literacy.
Mhm.
So in business or in computer science, et cetera, all their students automatically come with tools, knowledge, basic software understanding, et cetera. There are other fields where that's not the case. So, and particularly at different levels of institution. And so what does it mean to be college educated? How do we have a discussion that, and for that matter, what does it mean to be high school educated? I mean, it's true at all levels. I mean, and we can't get away with saying, well, our problem is they're not educating people in high school. And, so we have to then do remedial stuff and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, it's everybody's responsibility to talk about everything. So, but anyway, the creativity standardization. Then the next contradiction is what we've been talking about, individual versus collective. We've done a lot to unleash individuals to be able to really explore their inclinations, their passions, freedom to do that. And that's been tremendous. On the other hand, we've lacked carrying forward the collective responsibilities that we have, which I've mentioned several that I think about. And then the last, I think, contradiction I would say is we've done a lot of work empirically. We've done a lot of pixel work. Like there's a lot of studies of plantations. There's a lot of studies of this and that. I mean, there's a lot of dissertations on Toni Morrison. There's a lot of specific stuff we've done. What we've, I think, been challenged by and not really made a lot of progress is their theoretical development. And by theoretical development, what I really mean is the summation of all that empirical work. For me, theory is a way of establishing patterns of summation so that you can generalize. And because when you do that, you can begin to find things that are affirmed, but you also discover silences, and you discover contradictions, and therefore you can then address those contradictions and fill in those silences. And I think that is because it's unfortunate that what people do is they think theory is making up language that validates your empirical. And it takes away the responsibility of bibliography, and it really focuses on the lack of respect for bibliography. Because if you did a bibliography, for example, of all of the work on Toni Morrison, and sum that up, and for that matter, all of the other great examples of Black literary producers, to be able to talk about Black literature. Give you an example of a project that we created that has been led by Mary Emma Graham at the University of Kansas on the history of the African-American novel. That project was started by our talking about how to use social science methodology to the study of Black literature. And because a lot of the literary criticisms, summations, were really cherry-picking books, many of which were written up in the New York Times Book Review, et cetera, and saying that's a way to talk about Black literature. We said, well, what if we actually did a census of Black novels? Including the ones that are self-published and serialized in church publications, and then talked about Black literature. And so then she began to organize that, and we have yet to really get to the point where, and I think the digitization process, making all of that accessible and searchable and comparative, et cetera, is going to help tremendously in terms of all of the questions. But just like a census, once you get all of that, then you can really unleash a new stage of theoretical development of Black literature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because then you'd actually have the substance of what you're talking about, and therefore can generalize on that basis as opposed. I mean, Barbara Christian, for example, has done great work. Her handpicked novels and other people. But anyway, I've made my point on that. For example, I just discovered that the brother at University of Pennsylvania has a project on census work in Africa. And one of the projects we have often talked about needing was a census of the Black experience in the world. In other words, if we're talking global, and of course that means, my God, you have to deal with language. Who's Black in all these different countries? You have to deal with what data is the government collecting. For example, France doesn't collect data on Black people because they say, well, if we did that, it would lead to racism. Well, if you don't know what the problems are, you can't solve the problem. So if you don't do it,
That's a sleight of hand right there.
Exactly. So we're really at the stage of thinking about how to collect data, how to organize it so that we can have theoretical work that isn't just musings around language, which is important. I mean, exercising your mind with different languages, but I mean, at a certain point, it's a language game. It doesn't necessarily need clarity around whatever you are supposed to be talking about. But you can learn the language of this scholar and the language of that scholar. Okay, that's one way to deal with it. Another way to deal with it is say, what is the reality we're trying to understand? Mm-hmm. And what are the generalized concepts and what are the patterns that make the most sense in trying to understand this? So.
Wow, I'm glad I asked this question too. I love this idea of the census. That's going to stick with me. I think everybody listening, as a way of not only imagining what you're talking about as a project, but actually exercising it. And you talking about computer literacy and digitization. I mean, this is where this stuff becomes incredibly important, as you said. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this last question. I mean, in some ways, I think you've answered it multiple times, but I'll go ahead and ask as a way of wrapping up. What's the question in the Black Studies context? What's the question or the issue you think we should all be talking about? Question we should all be asking?
Yeah. Well, this kind of reveals my background in social science. I think at the highest level of abstraction, my question is, why is society possible? For example, for me, one of the ways in which that question operates in my head is, why is it possible to be a Black intellectual and not go postal, given what you know about the savagery of racism in the society in which you're trying to live? How can you accept the privilege that you have as a Black studies professional, faculty, graduate student, what have you, in a society where the vast majority of Black people are exploited and oppressed and, fighting for a decent way of life. And we use that experience of all those people as our professional task to try to create knowledge that we call knowledge about it, while at the same time watching it experience itself. And and that, why is society possible? I mean, in other words, is it possible to end racism? Is democracy possible? I mean, we live in a society that calls itself the leader of the free world and democratic society. That's it's not true. So, how do we deal with that? I mean, I was sitting down talking to Rufus Clement, who at that point was president of Atlanta University when I went to teach at Spelman. And he said that he was on the Atlanta School Board. And routinely in their meetings, they would use the N-word to talk about Black people. He's sitting there. And he said, look, I have a choice to make. I can fight them over that, or I could use my presence there to make sure that we get more equitable treatment in the pay scale of Black teachers. And so I'm sitting there listening from my generational point of view. And while I began to understand the practical reality of making life better, I also understood that his generation was different than the leaps that we were fighting for in the transformation of society. And I think that that tension between what you can do and plans to make a leap to what you want to do or what the people need you to do, that tension is what really is the way to become part of the basic historical tendency of Black intellectual history. I feel, and I'm concerned, that many of our colleagues are too goddamn comfortable in being at the level of their achievement and the rewards that they get from their achievement. I mean, we have Black studies people that are making way up in six figures. I mean, Claudia Gray, the president of Harvard, her salary is almost $1 million a year. Now, look, I'm not against anybody getting a payday. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
People should get paid. But there's a certain point at which being pulled inside this higher levels of reward, and for some people, it's $90,000. That's a lot of money. And when you look at most faculty, particularly faculty that are adjunct, and given the way things are going in terms of hiring adjuncts as opposed to tenured track and tenured, and et cetera. But we really need to have, and I think the attacks on DEI are going to start producing a more radical tendency in the field of Black studies. I think the opposite is also going to be true. There are going to be people who are going to start trying to, how can I change what I'm doing so that I say, okay. But I also think they're going to be the radicalization. We're entering a period where I'm thinking there's going to be a radicalization of the middle class, Black middle class. And on the one hand, it's going to happen because the reduction of federal employees is going to impact the Black middle class directly.
Yeah, that's for sure.
In Black studies, it's, the Pentagon, the Air Force used to use a film on the Tuskegee Airmen. That's been taken down now because of the attack on DEI.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're changing the approach to Black history in the Pentagon, it's going to, Michigan hired their DEI person, their diversity person. Harvard, this is way out. Harvard had a project on the slavery in the history of Harvard.
Yep.
It was funded to the tune of $100 million. They fired their internal staff dealing with that project, and they transferred it to this organization called American Ancestors. Have you ever heard of them?
No.
This is the organization, the genealogical organization of the Mayflower generation.
Oh, Jesus.
The first president was created in 1845. And it's been there all along, and they're highly funded, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I'm wondering how many of the people that Harvard fired were Black. Part of the important wave toward correcting history. I mean, I'm putting out on Abdul's list a list of the slavery legacy projects at the Ivy League institutions, and everyone except Cornell has one, studying the history of slavery in relationship to their own, institution. And that's important. But the DEI focus of the Trump administration is forcing changes to occur. This has got to impact Black studies.
Yeah.
And if people don't realize it, it's going to get to you one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to then say, well, where do we draw the line? Or how do we respond? And to me, one of the responses has to be a desire for standardization, closed ranks. Where do we draw the line? This is where we stand. In other words, we can't teach about Rosa Parks and not say she's African American.
Yeah.
To use an example.
I laugh at that example, but that's where we are.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of this. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation. And as I said at the beginning, like the chance to have your voice on this podcast is a real treat and a real privilege for the series. And this has been phenomenal. I mean, there's so much to think about, and I can't wait for this to get into circulation. You're going to give everybody who listens in so much to contemplate, and not just contemplate and think about and feel edified, but feel challenged and troubled. And I appreciate that. That's I want that in this podcast. And you the way you've challenged me and everyone who listens, who cares about the field of Black studies, is coming from, I think, really the most righteous of possible places, which is the deepest concern for the field, because the field's concerned with the lives and meaning of Black people. So all that to say, the deepest thank you and gratitude. So I appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness and insight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.